Exodus chapter 21, verses 22 and 23. If men strive, and hurt a woman with child, so that her fruit depart from her, and yet no mischief follow, he shall be surely punished, according as the woman's husband will lay upon him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. And if any mischief follow, then thou shalt give life for life.
I assume you have a good reason for being up there?
Of course. I wish to rise above the mundane and draw closer to the divine.
White!
Thou art a wretched sinner.
You know, that wasn't my fault. You're the one who flashed me. What were you doing up there anyway?
Well, I've been reading the Bible and other works so I can better understand how abortion became murder.
Oh, that's right. You told me once before that evangelical Christians weren't always anti-abortion.
That's correct.
You also didn't want to talk about it at the time.
Also correct. I wanted to be a little more certain about my findings.
And now?
Now? Let's talk about it. Before Reagan, Protestant evangelicals by and large regarded opposition to abortion as a Catholic position. The evangelical position was more nuanced. Norman Geisler was a prominent American evangelical apologetics writer. Over half a century, he wrote 90 books on topics such as philosophy, theology, biblical inerrancy, and ethics. In his 1971 book, Ethics, Alternatives, and Issues, Geisler addressed the topic of abortion in Chapter 12, The Christian and Birth Control and Abortion. He states that while abortion is a very serious activity, it is not murder, citing no less a luminary than Moses to back that up. According to Exodus chapter 21, the killing of an unborn fetus was not considered a capital offense, but killing an infant, child, or adult was. However, while an unborn fetus was not fully human, neither was it subhuman. Geisler lays out the case for abortion being permitted in the event of rape, incest, and birth defects, but states that it's not ethical after viability or as a method of family planning.
Why use abortion for family planning when there's birth control?
But there isn't always birth control. When Geisler wrote this book, contraception was something of a middle-class luxury, out of the reach of the working classes since the 16th and 17th centuries. Actually, it still is. Availability is better now, but contraception is still out of reach for a lot of people.
Wait. Since the 16th and 17th centuries, it was available before?
Possibly. In fact, the Bible itself, in Numbers 5, hints at knowledge of a potion capable of inducing a miscarriage. It was given to women suspected of infidelity.
Oh, so if she was pregnant and her husband didn't know.
Yes. Historian John Riddle has hypothesized that before the advent of capitalism, many women were aware of herbal remedies to prevent conception or induce a miscarriage. You look skeptical.
I wouldn't think women would forget something that important.
The knowledge wasn't forgotten, it was suppressed. When the witch hunts came along, what do you think happened to the women who knew how to brew such potions?
Oh no.
Riddle's hypothesis isn't a sure thing. He's guessing at the existence of an oral tradition passed down between women. That knowledge was lost when witch hunts stripped women of their power and restricted them to subordinate roles under early capitalism. But even if Riddle's hypothesis is wrong, women throughout history have sought to control their own fertility. Abstention and birth control where possible, abortion where not. The ancient Greeks and Romans practiced abortion. In English law, abortion before the first movement of the fetus, called the quickening, was not considered an offense, while abortion of a quick fetus was criminalized only in 1803. In the United States, the first laws regulating abortion were enacted in 1821 and only gradually spread across the country. The late 19th and early 20th century saw the enactment of many laws restricting civil rights. Labor organizing, political activity, and voting rights were all limited, especially for Black Americans and immigrants. While some of these restrictions were loosened, for example, the nationwide prohibition on alcohol was repealed, labor was allowed to organize, and the federal government took its first steps towards improved civil rights for Black Americans, by 1960, abortion was criminalized in nearly all states.
I'm not surprised. Men have been trying to control women's bodies forever.
To be fair, it could be argued that regulating abortion was a legitimate state interest.
What, making more babies?
No, Before the development of antibiotics, abortion was a hazardous procedure that invited potentially life-threatening infection.
Yeah, but a lot of women died as a result of pregnancies going wrong.
And a lot died when pregnancies went well. In general, it just wasn't a good idea to be a woman.
Well, that much hasn't changed.
The 1960s arrived, with huge demands for change. Second-wave feminism sought the removal of legal and cultural barriers to women's rights. Working women were just as miserable under capitalism as working men, but condescending patriarchal social attitudes made it worse. The availability of oral contraception and safe abortion made it easier for women to demand reproductive rights. In 1965, the Supreme Court ruled that married couples could use contraception without government restriction. This was extended to unmarried couples in 1972 and to juveniles 16 and older in 1977. That 1965 case is Griswold v. Connecticut. By a 7-2 majority, the court ruled that the Bill of Rights, particularly the Ninth Amendment, implied a right to privacy. The right is further implied by the due process clauses in the 14th Amendment. The question of abortion rights divided public opinion. The National Conference of Catholic Bishops spearheaded the creation of the National Right to Life Committee in 1967, which separated itself from the Catholic Church after Roe. A conference on abortion laws in 1969 led to the formation of the National Abortion Rights Action League, or NARAL.
Oh, wow. A bunch of men created the Right to Life Committee.
Catholic bishops, yes.
Like I said, men. And who created NARAL?
It was a conference, 20 organizations, 350 people, diverse opinions. Some attendees wanted abortion on demand, some people wanted abortion available only for rape, incest, and health of the parent.
How many men?
I don't know about the whole conference, but the planning committee was almost evenly split between men and women.
So, a diverse grassroots organization.
I don't know about grassroots, but diverse, I suppose so.
Well, the anti-abortion group was just a bunch of men dictating what women could do.
In their defense, the devoutly religious have never believed women were fully human.
How is that a defense?
Good point. The Roe decision in 1973 was welcomed as a fair resolution of a difficult issue. A few days after the decision, the Baptist Press, a news service of the Southern Baptist Convention, published an analysis stating that religious liberty, human equality, and justice are advanced by the decision. That same January 31st issue pointed out that it was a strict constructionist court that had rendered the decision, not a Warren-type or liberal court. It stated that most religious leaders other than Catholic ones hailed the decision with enthusiasm. It pointed out that the Southern Baptist Convention had no official position on abortion, implying that it was regarded as a matter of personal conscience.
Baptists were pro-choice?
Yes. Not all of them. Some state Baptist conventions, in Illinois and Michigan for example, made their opposition to abortion on demand quite clear, but the majority of Baptists and other evangelicals supported Roe.
All this time I thought it was the Supreme Court that got them riled up.
It was.
You just said a majority of evangelicals supported Roe.
It wasn't the Roe decision that motivated them to enter politics. It was the Bob decision. In 1954, the Brown v. Board of Education decision set in motion the racial desegregation of American schools. White parents and politicians across the country, especially in the states of the old Confederacy, resisted. Some public school districts closed entirely, and when their schools reopened, they were all black. White parents began sending their children to private schools. These segregation academies were often affiliated with Protestant or evangelical churches and were granted tax-exempt status as educational institutions. That status changed in 1971 when a unanimous Supreme Court ruled schools ineligible for tax exemptions if they practiced racial discrimination. One private religious institution, Bob Jones University, had long supported politicians who promoted segregation. Its founder had stated in a 1960 sermon, "If you are against segregation and against racial separation, then you are against God Almighty. God is the author of segregation." Bob Jones and other evangelical whites had defended segregation on biblical grounds for decades, but the civil rights movement had turned public opinion against legal segregation. Bob Jones University claimed that, as a private religious university, it could conduct its affairs as it saw fit and retain its tax-exempt status under the Freedom of Religion Clause of the First Amendment. The federal government did not accept this argument, and in 1976 formally revoked the university's tax exemption. With that, Bob Jones University became the focus of evangelical opposition to desegregation. It was now 3 years since Roe. For Roe's first anniversary, a few hundred Catholics had protested the decision. On the second anniversary, and on the third, thousands gathered. and they were joined by conservative evangelicals. In 1976 and 1978, anti-abortion voters gave a small number of conservative Republican candidates the boost they needed to win their races. Conservative organizer Paul Weyrich was looking for an issue around which to mobilize voters. He had found that outrage and discontent motivated voters better than well-articulated issues. He found an ally in televangelist Jerry Falwell, who had been persuaded to take a stand on abortion by theologian Francis Schaeffer.
Oh, I've heard of him.
Francis Schaeffer?
Jerry Falwell. Are you telling me that even Jerry Falwell used to be pro-choice?
He was ambivalent. Like other evangelical leaders, Falwell originally looked on anti-abortion activism as a Catholic issue. He wanted to talk about the gospel, not about social issues.
I don't believe it.
Originally, Falwell and Pat Robertson and other televangelists were all about a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. They believed contraception was fine. It was another thing that separated them from the Catholics. Remember, many evangelicals were very suspicious of Catholicism. Some regarded the Catholic Church as a false church, even satanic.
But they ended up working with Catholics. Why?
Because it changed the subject.
It did what now?
Southern evangelicals had been wrong to support racial segregation, not just wrong in the public's eye, but morally wrong, just as their ancestors had been morally in the wrong to support slavery. So they stopped talking about God as the author of segregation and started claiming that abortion was murder. It is an interesting feature of American religious history that major religious disputes are never resolved through theological debate, but instead by dropping or changing the subject. The Southern Baptist Convention split from their Northern brethren because Northern Baptist churches were increasingly dominated by anti-slavery elements. Southern society was built on the enslavement of black Americans. Religious leaders were part of that society's elite, and they sermonized accordingly. The failure of the Bible to condemn slavery was a common defense of slavery. There are verses in the Bible that encourage masters to be kind to their servants, and servants to be obedient to their masters. These verses were presented as divine approval of slavery. Abolitionist clerics stressed the themes of justice, mercy, and compassion that ran through the teachings of Christ, and how those themes were in direct contradiction with the injustice and cruelty of slavery. Southern clerics ignored the themes and pointed to the literal words of the Bible, which nowhere condemned slavery, but instead accommodated it. Biblical literalism was a key defense in the theological debate over slavery. The Civil War destroyed the institution of slavery, but the theological debate was never resolved. Southern religious leaders never reckoned with their failings. They never studied where their interpretations of the Bible went wrong. They never renounced their pro-slavery sermons. They simply stopped talking about it. In the 20th century, white clerics, ministers, and theologians issued sermons and edicts to give white supremacy the same divine endorsement their predecessors had claimed for slavery. Just as abolitionists had done, Christian opponents of segregation appealed to biblical themes of justice and love. Defenders of segregation used biblical literalism to shore up their position. But once public opinion decisively turned against legally enforced segregation, once it was widely perceived as immoral, religious leaders who had supported segregation never reckoned with their moral failings. There was never a mea culpa, and never an examination of how their readings of the Bible had led them astray. They simply stopped talking about it. Opposing abortion not only allowed evangelical leaders to change the subject, but also allowed them to reclaim the moral high ground, which they had lost because of their defense of segregation.
I can't believe no one ever called them on it.
What do you mean?
I mean, they were wrong about the biggest moral issue of the day.
Yes.
Why would anyone take their word on any other issue?
Because their people wanted absolution.
What?
In general, people don't want to think of themselves as evil, as immoral.
Well, what's that got to do with it?
Even the most ardent segregationists were trying to defend their way of life as they knew it. They were heroes in their own minds.
The most ardent segregationists were racist assholes.
But once white supremacy is regarded as a bad thing, you can still be a hero by electing anti-abortion conservatives. By sheer coincidence, anti-abortion conservatives also oppose policies intended to remedy the ongoing social consequences of racial segregation and slavery.
I don't think it's a coincidence.
It's not. Politicians and judges who oppose abortion rights also oppose women's rights, voting rights, labor rights, economic rights. Everything they do is in opposition to human rights and is immoral. Being anti-abortion is a cynical cover for their immorality, for if they can convince people that abortion is murder, then they can get away with murder.
You sound angry.
I am. Anti-abortion leaders are engaging in a cynical exercise of power, and have been for decades. Anti-abortion leaders do not advocate for policies that would make abortion rare or unnecessary. which is strange for a movement that calls itself pro-life. They never lobby for expanded access to prenatal care or health care for children and parents. They never lobby for expanded funding for foster care or child welfare agencies or shelters for runaway teens, abused parents, and homeless children. They're never heard calling for more and better daycare centers or job guarantees for new parents or any of the things that would make it possible to carry an unexpected pregnancy to term and raise the resulting child. They never lobby for medical research that might help us learn why so many pregnancies spontaneously abort. Given how extreme their rhetoric is, they also ask surprisingly little of their followers. They tell their partisans that abortion is murder, that millions of these legal murders amount to an American Holocaust. Yet the only thing asked of their followers is that they donate money and vote Republican. Occasionally they will ask their followers to show up at a rally or to picket a clinic in order to bully women who are at a very vulnerable time in their lives. Donations, demonstrations, and voting are all pretty standard politics. It's what I do in response to the injustices I see around me. How to deal with murder and other crime is a subject of study and debate. If I were an opinion leader on criminal matters, I would be attempting to influence people to vote for politicians who can be persuaded to enact policies I feel would minimize the number of such crimes. But one cannot respond to a Holocaust with standard politics. Something that grave deserves a non-standard response. If human lives are at stake, immediate and drastic action is required. Demonstrations should be perpetual, a general strike absolutely critical. Stop the world until this issue is dealt with. Yet calls for a general strike are not something we tend to hear from anti-abortion leaders. When there's an act of terrorism against a women's health clinic, or when an OBGYN is murdered, the most visible and well-funded anti-abortion leaders condemn violence. They condemn violence even when those terrorists quote them. Anti-abortion leaders respond to such incidents as if they never expected their extreme rhetoric to be taken seriously.
That's because it's not about abortion, it's about controlling women.
I don't agree with you there.
Oh, come on.
It's about power in general, maintaining personal fiefdoms, maintaining a social hierarchy in which one group has power over another. Whites over blacks, men over women. When abortion was largely illegal, upper-class women could still travel to places where it was legal, if allowed by their husbands.
It's about money, too. A general strike shuts down the economy. They won't call one.
You're right. Money and power, not ethics or morality, seems to be at the heart of the anti-abortion movement. Tying themselves to wealthy, well-connected conservatives gave religious leaders access to resources which they used to build personal empires.
They spent church donations on themselves.
They invested it to get more money and more power. Jerry Falwell, for example, had founded Lynchburg Baptist College. After he embraced anti-abortion politics, the money that flowed his way let him expand it. He renamed it Liberty University in 1985. Liberty turns out conservative activists, which give him and other conservative leaders more power and an ongoing source of donations.
I always knew televangelists were just con men.
Well, they have to be. Maintaining those empires requires keeping donors and voters motivated. Those who don't keep them motivated are no longer relevant. So to keep their power, religious leaders need more controversies, which in turn requires more enemies. That's why the same people who are anti-abortion are also going after gay rights and trans rights and immigrants and non-Christians. The moment they stop naming enemies, they lose power.
But they're so obvious about it. I can't believe anyone falls for their bullshit.
Remember, people are more susceptible to con games that offer them something they want. They fall for bullshit because they want to believe it. And to a degree, although I'm angry with them, I sympathize with the people who follow these men.
They're trying to take away people's rights. They're trying to hurt people.
I know.
Then how can you sympathize with them?
Imagine you are a true believer in the religious franchise in which you were raised, or the one which you've chosen. You are concerned about the afterlife, heaven and hell. You want to go to heaven. You want your children and grandchildren to go to heaven. But a pluralistic culture, a secular culture, draws them away from the one true path to heaven. If that happens, if they screw up their one and only life on earth, your God will allow them to go to hell, where they will suffer for eternity. A secular, pluralistic America imperils your family's salvation. You and your fellow believers have to change the culture so that the people you love don't go to hell. So what do you do to save your family from eternal torment? Anything. An easy answer like vote Republican is welcome. Donating money or time can help you feel like you're in the fight. To really show you're serious, though, you need to help break some commandments. Consider that good Christian people are telling lies about, bearing false witness against, Planned Parenthood. They claim that abortions rake in huge profits for Planned Parenthood and other organizations that perform abortions. In reality, these organizations are donor-funded and perpetually short of cash. That's why laws which force them to comply with expensive regulations, so-called trap laws, are so effective. And of course, you don't stop at bearing false witness against Planned Parenthood. Abortion is just one front in the fight against a diverse and secular culture. You have to attack along every front. When your leaders give you a new target, you go after it. After all, when you're fighting for your family's afterlives, the culture war is a real war.
I don't sympathize. I'm angry that religious people are so willing to hurt others.
Most religious people find solace in their faith. No, they don't find me. I wasn't trying to be funny. There are some who hate America as they think it is today, because they have this fear that a diverse and secular America will abolish their way of life, their religion, that the other will dominate their lives. And I feel bad for them.
I'm sure they don't want your pity.
I'm sure they don't. I just think that if they could get out of their bubbles and see what America is really like, I think they'd love America and Americans.
You're way too optimistic.
Maybe I am, but consider that most religious Americans don't actually believe the lies they're told about abortion.
You could have fooled me.
It's true. The arguments against abortion are so unpersuasive that unless you hear them again and again, you're unlikely to believe them. Consider that a majority of American Catholics, and remember, it's Catholics who are the source of the anti-abortion movement in the United States. A majority of American Catholics believe abortion should be legal in most or all cases. The ones who go to Mass more frequently tend to be anti-abortion. And even then, among Catholics who attend Mass weekly, a third still defy their priests and support abortion rights.
But the ones who believe life begins at conception will...
Almost nobody actually believes that.
They say that...
They say they believe it, but they don't act like it. If they did, March 3rd would be an annual day of mourning.
What happened on March 3rd?
In 2018, at the University Hospital's fertility clinic in Ohio, a freezer tank failed, resulting in the loss of 4,000 fertilized eggs and embryos. Almost 1,000 of the clinic's patients lost their genetic legacy. Many patients were by then sterile and would never have a pregnancy come to term. They can still adopt, of course, but not being with a child from the instant of birth? That's a tremendous personal loss.
That's terrible. But why should it be an annual day of mourning?
Because if life begins at conception, that's 4,000 dead people. More than were lost on 9/11. While I'm glad that anti-abortion leaders aren't exploiting these very personal tragedies, it seems strange that they would not.
Yeah, it does. Anti-abortion activists are such scumbags.
Some fit that description. It's not unusual for anti-abortion political leaders who have urged a mistress to get an abortion.
Oh! Why am I not surprised that the family values guys have mistresses?
If you really value families, you'll start a lot of them. Think of it as franchising.
I'd rather not think of it at all.
Then I'd better not tell you about Governor Eric Gretians of Missouri, who signed into law some of the country's strictest abortion laws. He resigned when the public learned he had sexually assaulted his hairdresser.
Ah, bastard.
Hastert?
No, bastard.
Oh, I thought you were referring to Dennis Hastert, Illinois Republican and former Speaker of the House of Representatives. He spent over a year in prison for buying the silence of people he had sexually abused when he had coached their wrestling class.
A child molester was Speaker of the House?
Yes.
And they dare lecture us on morality.
When you're anti-abortion, they let you do it. You can do anything. Pursue immoral behaviors in private and immoral policies in public. You can oppose women's rights, voting rights, labor rights, economic rights. You can advocate for policies that hurt millions of people for the benefit of a very few. As I said, being anti-abortion provides cover for this kind of immorality, and a leader who can convince people that abortion is murder can get away with murder.
How can they call themselves Christians? Jesus comforted everyone they want to hurt.
Are you sure?
Yeah, it's in the Bible. They can't change that. Oh, they didn't.
Exodus chapter 21 deals in part with how to adjudicate violence between people, punishments for injuring each other, punishments for injuring slaves, and in verses 22 to 25, punishments for injuring pregnant women. If the woman is seriously injured, the penalty is life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. But the penalty for disrupting her pregnancy is different. The first English translation of the Bible, by John Wycliffe in the 14th century, says that, if men chide, and a man smiteth a woman with child, and soothly he maketh the child dead-born, but the woman liveth, he shall be subject to the harm, that is, a fine. The King James Version says that if a woman with child is hurt so that her fruit depart from her, and yet no mischief follow, he shall be surely punished, according as the woman's husband will lay upon him. and he shall pay as the judges determine. Later Bible editions have generally agreed on the broad strokes when translating this section. My mother had a modern English translation called the Jerusalem Bible from 1966. It reads, "If, when men come to blows, they hurt a woman who is pregnant and she suffers a miscarriage, though she does not die of it, the man responsible must pay the compensation demanded of him by the woman's master." This is one of the verses that Norman Geisler used in the 70s to make his case that abortion is not murder. But in the 80s, abortion was politicized. In the 90s, Bible translations were adjusted to match the new politics. In modern translations, miscarriage is now often translated as giving birth prematurely, and the subject of the injury made vague so that it may apply either to the woman or to the fetus. It's also worth noting that Exodus was written by and for Jews, who are not known for their opposition to abortion rights. In fact, Jews favor abortion rights roughly 5-1. And of course, the Bible's been changed on other topics or otherwise shaped to fit an agenda many times.
They claim the Bible is the Word of God, but they have no problem changing it.
Sometimes it has to be done to give a congregation what they want.
What they want is moral instruction. Isn't that why they go to church?
No, they go to church for comfort. Do you think that in the antebellum South, sermons on the evils of slavery changed minds? Those who preached those kinds of sermons were soon replaced with those who spoke of slavery as a necessary evil. Even those were replaced with those who proclaimed the Bible supported slavery as a positive good.
Man, people suck.
No, we just want to be comfortable. When something makes us uncomfortable, we fight back.
The only thing making these people uncomfortable is the idea of women making their own decisions.
That's part of it, I'm sure.
That's all of it. They see us as property, the property of men.
Which men?
The men in our lives. We start off as daddy's little girl, then he gives us away when we get married to our husbands.
This isn't the 20th century. We don't have to take our husband's name when we marry.
But that's when the shit started. When we began to have more control over our lives and our bodies.
That is true. But it makes sense to object to that if one believes that women are not fully human.
That explains a lot. You know what got me interested in abortion politics? Iraq.
Excuse me?
Yeah. I used to be kind of like the guy you mentioned, abortion is a serious matter, but not murder.
Geisler.
Bless you. And one day I was minding my own business. I was walking across a Planned Parenthood parking lot. It was the quickest way to the park. A guy threw a rock at me. One of the pro-lifers, I guess. You could call them that. There's blood everywhere. Right here. They threw rocks at the building, cars, at women, pro-life. What a lie. We can make our own decisions. We don't need men throwing rocks at us to discourage us from doing so.
They don't agree. Women aren't fully human. We are incapable of making moral or ethical decisions. That's why we need to be tied to men who are moral beings. That's why single motherhood is bad. That's why women marrying women is bad.
Oh, bullshit. The Bible says that both Adam and Eve ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Or have they rewritten that part too?
No, but they'll overlook it and any other parts that make them uncomfortable. Like I said, we want to be comfortable. And when something makes us uncomfortable, we fight back.
Even when what we're comfortable with is immoral.
That's when we fight back hardest. We generally want to think of ourselves as good people, moral people. We're very good at inventing justifications for bad behavior. It takes effort and bravery to look at ourselves, at our behaviors and attitudes, and ask, am I right?
I don't think I'm wrong. I think parenthood should be voluntary. Pretty simple. But conservatives disagree.
I've been wrong so often I come to expect it. Even enjoy it if it's a chance to learn something new. But I don't feel I have anything to learn from evangelical leaders. They failed a major moral test on segregation. Remember the BJU case?
BJ University.
The Bob Jones University case? Let me tell you how it ended. In 1983, the Supreme Court ruled 8-1 that Bob Jones could not receive tax exemptions while it practiced racial discrimination. BJU paid $1 million in back taxes. The one holdout in that decision? William Rehnquist, a longtime supporter of racial segregation. Ronald Reagan made him Chief Justice in 1986. Too many evangelical leaders defended injustice and used the Bible to defend that injustice. I don't think it wise to trust their reading of the Bible on abortion or anything else.
Amen.
John chapter 16, verses 12 and 13. I have yet many things to say unto you, but ye cannot bear them now. Howbeit when she, The Spirit of truth is come. She will guide you into all truth, for she shall not speak of herself, but whatsoever she shall hear, that shall she speak, and she will show you things to come.